Good morning, folks. Everything new under the sun. It is Monday, April 29th. We've got several things happening. The news is I think it's becoming ominous that we are potentially near economic collapse and war. What often happens with world war is you have an economic collapse of sorts, a resetting of things, prices, price of oil, price of food, etc. And one could cause the other. A war could cause an economic collapse. An economic collapse could cause war. And I think we're getting close to both of those. And I really think both of those are required to really kick off the end-time biblical prophecy for various reasons. I think you need an economic collapse to convince the world really to accept a one-world leader and a one-world currency. I think you need world war, at least in the Middle East where all the world is paying attention, to convince the world that we need a 7-year peace treaty, and to really push the world to then put pressure on the Middle East, Israel, Palestinians, to accept a peace deal. So I think war and economic collapse are really two key pieces, drivers, if you will, that catapult us, put us into end-time Bible prophecy. And those two things would put us in directly into end-time Bible prophecy very, very quickly. Not only that, those two items could easily knock out Western powers. I believe an economic collapse would easily kick out Western powers, take Western powers out of any end-time Bible prophecy, and that's why you don't see the United Kingdom, Britain, you don't see Canada, you don't see Australia, you don't see the United States in Ezekiel 38, 39, in Isaiah 17, when these big end-time biblical events are happening. They've never happened before. The destruction of Damascus, for example. It has not been fully destroyed. It's the longest running city pretty much in the history of the world, and not being ever fully conquered, demolished. But the Bible says in Isaiah 17 it's going to become a ruinous heap. And so you have these end-time Bible prophecies which are significant, and you see nowhere in them Western nations, Western powers, the current world superpower of the United States. So you've seen this keynote presentation. I've went over it, and it's probably about time to do another whole video about it, but I have this timeline, and I just speculate on when certain events are going to be occurring. And I think the 7-year tribulation probably starts around the year 2021, and the end of all years of man on this planet culminates in about the year 2028, or about 6,000 years of the history of man. How do I get there? Well, I suggest to you that the last 2,000 years, the last 2 days of the history of man, started at the milestone event where Jesus Christ died on the cross. That really kicked off the last 2 days of human history. If human history is 6 days, if you equate it to the 6 days of creation, on the 7th day of creation God rested. I believe on the 7th day, that will be the millennial reign of Christ. And so the 6 days, or 6 years, 6,000 years of man are coming to an end. A day to the Lord is 1,000 years, and 1,000 years is like a day. So we're sitting at this point in the year 2019 where we have 2 years to go before 2021, which I believe, and others believe as well, that is when the 7-year tribulation starts. So I have the first arrow on the left-hand side. The red arrow says we are here. So we are here somewhere in the middle of 2019. I believe an economic collapse really triggers the major Middle East war, and that could lead, I think the economic collapse is what leads to Western nations, specifically the United States, being removed from end-time Bible prophecy, being removed as a significant nation. So you have the economic collapse there, arrow, and then you have Isaiah 17, Ezekiel 38 in there. I suggest in there that all wrapped up in Isaiah, even prior to Isaiah 17 and Ezekiel 38, is a war which somehow takes out Western nations, or a war that maybe Western nations are involved in, and they come out of it with not a lot of power. The U.S. ceases to be a world superpower. And I suggest to you that maybe the U.S. could be involved in that, but even more likely than that, I think an economic collapse takes out the Western nations. And so, but along with an economic collapse comes war, as people do whatever they can. There's riots or civil war in Western nations, etc., as they grapple with, as they struggle with economic collapse, just trying to feed themselves. If they're just trying to feed themselves, just try and stay alive themselves, where the government is dealing with civil war, then you would have a situation where the Middle East could be on fire and there would be no Western intervention, simply because they didn't have the will or the power, because their countries were in their own state of collapse, civil war, and famine, effectively. And so I think that's what the cause of the lack of Western nations in end-time Bible prophecy, specifically Isaiah 17 and Ezekiel 38 and 39. So I think we're right in this time zone. We're counting down the months now, not any more the years, to what I believe is the 7-year tribulation. I could be wrong, but this is something to watch. And as watchmen on the wall, this is what we do. We watch world events. We try and understand what they mean, and we try and understand the signs of the times and understand when, what the Lord plans and when, because He gives us an incredible amount of details in the Scriptures. So moving on, let's see the news articles, which I believe get us there. So this is one article. Let's start with this. We need to pray for Christians. I need to pray for our Christians around the world. In Egypt, they're being beaten and killed in the name of Jesus. Christian priests beaten and clubbed by Muslim mob in front of 200 children at Egypt Sunday school. A Coptic Christian church is closed after Muslim mob beats a priest in front of the kids. So, boy, you talk about terrorizing the kids. This Christian was beaten in front of them, and it's horrifying, really. It's distressing. But this is happening in Egypt, where the kids are experiencing the beating of their pastors, their priests, by people of other religions. There is a holy war going on, and it's waging around the world, but mainstream Western media, of course, doesn't want to say that there's a holy war going on, but this is happening in Egypt today. Going on here, could war between Israel and Iran begin in the Middle East? Absolutely will begin in the Middle East. I think that's a kind of a bad name. Obviously, it's going to happen in the Middle East. But I suggest that there's I suggest that there is potential war coming sooner than we think, and there's an uneasy feeling in the air, I think, right now, as it relates to economic conditions and a buildup for war in the Middle East. And I think this is what's coming. I think the U.S. has aircraft carriers there for a reason. We're going to read a story about an unidentified aircraft going over Syria, where Iran was worried enough that they were evacuating their personnel from particular locations because of these aircraft. And I think those aircraft are probably Israeli or American aircraft. If Iran, I think is what people want me to call it, if Iran uses its forces and fires to launch an attack near Israeli-Syrian border, it is possible that a war between Tel Aviv and Tehran could occur sooner rather than later. So there's several articles speaking about, there's something happening. There's a buildup happening there. And, of course, with the removal of, or with the implementation of all the sanctions, the removal of any waivers of the sanctions to Iran's oil, this has put Iran in a state where they're backed into a corner. They're now threatening action in the Strait of Hormuz and shutting it down, really. Let's look at this article. Syria. Iranians evacuate after unidentified aircraft seen in East Syria. The aircraft were not Russian, they weren't Iranian, they weren't Syrian. A large presence of military vehicles has been reported in the area since the aircraft was spotted. So you have this buildup. You have unidentified aircraft here. Iran began evacuating headquarters at Deir al-Zohar area in eastern Syria on Sunday after unidentified aircraft flew over it for 30 minutes. This is probably a reconnaissance aircraft, whether Israeli or U.S. This image here is a B-52, a U.S. B-52, not what was flying over Syria, but unidentified nonetheless. So it wasn't Russian. And so they're worried that a larger U.S.-Israeli strike is coming, and they are gathering intelligence right now. The source stated the aircraft did not carry out attacks, but circled for 30 minutes and then left. No shots were fired. So you definitely do not have, say, the S-300 sitting there shooting down aircraft, as this was allowed to fly around the location of the Iranian base for 30 minutes straight, basically collecting intelligence. So what could this be? And I think Iran is quickly getting scared into a corner, getting put in a corner where they're going to have to strike back. They're getting pushed there economically and militarily. They're getting pushed back in Syria. They're really a ton of pressure by U.S. and Israel on Iran in Syria, and I think Russia is allowing it right now. Not only that, but you have now the U.S. really pressuring Iran oil-wise, related to its oil, and really shutting down any sources of revenue. And they're already in economic collapse in Iran. Iran threatens to shutter Straits of Hormuz shipping routes. So they're potentially declaring war on the world, and specifically the U.S., by shutting down the Strait of Hormuz. So the water is the white area here. You have the Strait of Hormuz. Iran on the northern part of this image. And because the strait is so thin relatively, Iran could easily threaten it with military ships and weaponry, to the point where oil companies wouldn't want to put their ships in danger and go through there, and could basically cut off, I forget what it is, 10 or 20% of world oil supply, which would jack up oil prices for sure. Iran's armed forces chief of staff threatened to close Strait of Hormuz, vital shipping route, in response to U.S. sanctions on the region, which he labeled a hostility. We are not after closing the Strait of Hormuz, but if hostility of enemies increase, we will be able to do so, it says. And this would effectively lead to World War III between the U.S. and Iran, because they want to keep stability in the region. They want to keep these shipping lanes open. They don't want to limit the oil, because that would jack up oil prices and absolutely cause trigger. It would be a trigger point for economic collapse. As we talk about economic collapse, and I think economic collapse is really the big turning point, the big key piece in end-time Bible prophecy, which I think really kicks off all the end-time Bible prophecy and all the prophetic wars. And it is the one thing that across the world would take out Western powers, because we don't see them named at all in the prophetic events in the last days. JP Morgan, we are fast approaching the point where banks run out of liquidity. So we're here again, back in the point where we were prior to 2008, where liquidity was decreasing, where economic collapse was coming. And we effectively did have economic collapse if it were not for all the quantitative easing, all the money printing that was done, which simply kicked the can down the road and ballooned the national debt of the United States and really the world, because the other countries of the world also did quantitative easing. They also printed money out of thin air in an effort to prop up the economy for the time being, but that kicks the can down the road in terms of the problem. They just push off the problem. They didn't actually solve anything by printing money. They actually made it worse, but they made it worse in the future. So more headlines. Goldman sparks Erdogan's fury, predicts the lira of Turkey will crash to an all-time low in 12 months. So Goldman Sachs is predicting basically a collapse of the currency in Turkey, and that's going to push Turkey further towards Russia, Iran. What happens in Ezekiel 38? Well, the Gog-Magog alliance comes to take a spoil, to take the gold, the silver, the food. That probably means you're in economic collapse territory, where which really pushes them and forces them into that situation. And so Turkey, the fact that their lira, that their economy is going to crash in the next 6 months, according to Goldman, means that they would be absolutely lined up in the Gog-Magog alliance to march on Israel and take maybe some of the spoil, maybe some of the money to prop up their government, to prop up, and Iran is in economic collapse as well. Maybe they want to go into Israel and take some spoil, take some oil, take some money, take some gold, silver, and food. And we know Russia is in economic trouble. They're quickly running out of oil, and Israel continues to find new oil reserves, massive Leviathan finds and other finds, gas and natural resources finds in Israel. And you have, so all the countries of the Gog-Magog alliance, which are in place now, are being predicted by Goldman Sachs, for one, to be in economic free fall and to be heading towards an economic collapse. And that is why Ezekiel 38 happens. That's one of the hooks in the jaw of Ezekiel 38, that they're in economic trouble. And so they march on Israel to take a spoil. That's what Ezekiel 38 says. And so I think the economic collapse fills and fulfills a number of the reasons why various nations are not mentioned in end-time Bible prophecy and why other nations are mentioned in Bible prophecy, and Ezekiel 38 spells it out. It says they've come to take a spoil. That's what the Western nations are asking, basically. Have you come to take a spoil? Recognizing that they're in economic freefall at that point in time. And that is really the cause of the war that is happening, and the march on Israel, the invasion, really, of Ezekiel 38 and 39. So you have Iran being pushed into a corner. You have Turkey in economic trouble. You have Russia, who is currently cooperating with the U.S., but really doesn't want to do that, and creates an alliance in the last days to march with Iran, Turkey, and allied nations, Libya, Ethiopia, etc. And you have what appears to be a situation, a setup for economic collapse in the rest of the world, which would take all Western nations out. Guys, if you don't see this coming, I'm putting it before you. I'm putting the articles out here. I think it's an ominous sort of a year, and we kind of say that every year, but we are getting so very close to some of the big events in end-time Bible prophecy, to the point at which I think we're very close to the economic collapse and the start of the 7-year tribulation. I think we're less than 2 years away from that at this point. Could I be wrong? Yes. Do the articles, the headlines from around the world point to this and seem to prop up and provide evidence towards this particular timeline? I think they do. And you're to judge it by yourself. You're to be a Berean, read your scriptures, understand what's happening. But I think we're very close to the last days, guys. I will leave there for today. Thanks for watching. Be prepared. Do you know Jesus Christ as your Lord and Savior? Ultimately, that's the only way we can be sure, and that's the only way we can get through this. And persecution will be coming. We read the first story about the Coptic Christians in Egypt being persecuted, being beaten for their faith. I think that's going to come to North America sooner than we think. And already pressure is put upon Christians in general for being exclusive, for not being accepting of other people's religions, and so we shouldn't, because we know the true God, and we know that they are not right with God, and we want to convince them of that, because if we don't, they're not going to be living with God in eternity. And so, yes, Christians need to stand up, and we need to be exclusive and say, look, your faith is not real. Our faith is the true faith. We believe in the true God, and we believe and we have the inspired scriptures that show us what's going on in the world by way of end-time Bible prophecy, and they tell us how to reach God. We are saved through faith in Jesus Christ, and no man gets to the Father except through Jesus Christ.